In the dense, humid jungles of the Pacific, where vines clung to rusted metal and shadows hid long-forgotten secrets of war, a small team of U.S. scouts pushed carefully through the undergrowth, their boots sinking into mud that smelled of decay and old battles, completely unaware that what they were about to discover would shift the balance of the entire Pacific conflict. They had been sent to investigate abandoned Japanese positions after a sudden enemy retreat, expecting to find nothing more than scattered equipment and empty trenches, but as they moved deeper, an unusual metallic glint caught the eye of Corporal Reeves, a quiet, sharp-eyed soldier who had learned to trust his instincts, and when he brushed aside the thick layer of leaves covering the object partially buried in the earth, his breath caught, not from fear, but from confusion, because this wasn't a standard Japanese weapon or supply container. It was long, cylindrical, damaged at the nose, and surprisingly heavy, like a sleek metal predator frozen in time, and as the rest of the squad crowded around it, Lieutenant Harris realized they weren't looking at a discarded shell. They were looking at something Japan had never intended America to find, a prototype torpedo unlike any they had seen before, its engineering impossibly advanced, almost unnervingly precise, with internal mechanisms that hinted at a level of sophistication far beyond the standard Japanese Type 93s the Allies had come to fear. Back on the beach, when the object was finally hauled onto a landing craft and sent for examination, the news spread across their unit like wildfire, each soldier sensing that whatever this thing was, it mattered more than any single weapon they had stumbled upon in months. And when it finally reached Pearl Harbor's engineering division, a room full of stunned American engineers gathered around the battered prototype, speechless as they cracked open the casing and discovered components that felt centuries ahead of what they had been fighting against. Guidance systems far more refined than anything in U.S. naval stock, an oxygen-based propulsion mechanism capable of astonishing silent travel, and most alarming of all, a warhead large enough to cripple a cruiser in a single devastating hit. As word moved up the command chain, admirals exchanged grave looks, because this wasn't just a better torpedo. This was a weapon that could reshape the Pacific War if Japan deployed it in numbers, and it became brutally clear that the Empire had planned to maintain this advantage in absolute secrecy, safeguarding it as their hidden trump card, but fate, and one rushed retreat, had betrayed that secrecy, making it possible for America to not only study the weapon but understand the terrifying implications of its existence. Meanwhile, in Japan, senior naval officers panicked when they realized one of their prototypes had gone missing, convening emergency meetings in dimly lit strategy rooms where maps of the Pacific stretched across entire walls, and though they tried desperately to determine whether the Americans had found it, no confirmation came, only fear, the silent dread that their most advanced technology was now in enemy hands. They had believed this design would grant them unparalleled control of the seas, allowing their long-range torpedoes to strike without warning, without sound, without mercy, traveling unheard across vast distances, ending ships before crews even knew they were targeted. But now that possibility, the advantage they had guarded with such careful secrecy, had begun slipping away, and in America, Admiral Lockwood, a man who had long understood the brutal chess game of submarine warfare, realized that if the U.S. learned how to counter this design, Japan would lose one of the last strategic advantages they possessed. He ordered immediate reverse engineering, mobilizing top specialists who worked around the clock, their desks covered in diagrams, calculations, and fragments of metal laid out like pieces of a deadly puzzle as they slowly uncovered not just how the torpedo worked but why it was such a threat, and with each breakthrough their urgency grew, because understanding this weapon meant saving ships, saving crews, and ensuring that Japan's unstoppable, phantom strike capability would never reach its full potential in the open ocean. Across weeks of testing, failures, and incremental progress, one fact became undeniable: the weapon's range was unmatched, far beyond anything America had believed possible, pushing performance limits so far that it forced the U.S. Navy to rethink every established assumption about torpedo warfare, and its accuracy, even in the damaged prototype, pointed to terrifying precision that could have allowed Japan to obliterate entire formations from beyond visual range, turning naval engagements into one-sided massacres. The sheer destructive capability packed into the warhead shocked even The most seasoned explosive experts, its payload engineered to detonate with a force that could tear through armored hulls like paper, leaving no survivors, no escape, and no warning. And when the engineering team finally realized that Japan's intention was to deploy these weapons silently across vast ocean distances to decimate American fleets before they could even engage, it became clear that this discovery hadn't just altered the war, it had prevented a potential catastrophe. As the U.S. rapidly redesigned anti-torpedo defenses, implementing new sonar techniques, countermeasures, and evasive drills based directly on what they had learned from the captured prototype, the tide began to turn, and American commanders noticed a subtle but significant shift in the effectiveness of Japanese naval strikes, their once feared long-range attacks now failing more frequently. Intercepted or evaded thanks to the precise knowledge gained from the weapon Japan never wanted them to see. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, whispers of the missing prototype spread fear across the Naval High Command, with engineers insisting that if America truly understood the weapon's capabilities, then Japan's strategic edge, painstakingly nurtured over years, would evaporate, and indeed, as months passed and American defenses strengthened, the Japanese Navy's confidence faltered, the once mighty Long Lance advantage fading into history as the U.S. neutralized it one calculated step at a time, proving that sometimes the most pivotal moments of war hinge not on battles or generals, but on a single forgotten piece of metal left behind in the shadows of a jungle, discovered not by admirals or scientists, but by tired scouts who had no idea that they had just uncovered the very secret that would shift the balance of the Pacific forever. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. As the captured prototype continued to reveal its secrets, the American engineers found themselves piecing together more than just a weapon. They were reconstructing an entire philosophy of warfare that Japan had quietly built beneath the waves, a doctrine centered on silent domination of the ocean, on ending battles before the enemy even knew they had begun, and every new insight only deepened their unease. Nights in the lab grew longer, with engineers hunched over blueprints under the harsh glow of overhead lamps, exhausted but driven by the knowledge that every hour mattered, because across the Pacific the Japanese Navy was preparing for what they believed would be a decisive push, unaware that America now held the key to dismantling one of their greatest strategic pillars. And in that tense atmosphere, Admiral Lockwood spent his days moving between submarine bases, briefing commanders on new evasive tactics, teaching crews how to detect the faint signature of the advanced Japanese torpedoes before they struck, transforming raw intelligence into survival techniques. While he kept the source of this knowledge a closely guarded secret, sailors aboard American submarines noticed the changes immediately. New drills, new maneuvers, new sonar listening patterns that seemed almost anticipatory, as though their officers suddenly knew exactly how the enemy's weapons behaved. And while no one questioned the orders, because in war, survival mattered more than explanations, they felt the shift, the subtle tightening in the Navy's posture, the sharpened awareness that something big had changed beneath the surface of the conflict. Meanwhile, in the dense corridors of Tokyo's naval ministry, worry fractured the once unshakable confidence of Japan's admirals, who gathered around tables scattered with charts and weapons reports, their voices hushed and strained as they speculated about the missing prototype, with some insisting the Americans couldn't possibly decipher such advanced technology from a damaged model, while others, more cautious, more realistic, warned that the Americans' industrial might made anything possible, stirring a quiet dread that the Empire's carefully guarded advantage was slipping through their fingers. In the shipyards of Kure and Yokosuka, Japanese engineers worked feverishly to assemble more units of the new torpedo design. But the manufacturing process was complex, fragile, requiring precision and resources that were beginning to run dry under the weight of Allied bombardment and tightening supply lines, and for every completed prototype, there were two more that failed, delayed, or broke under testing, a stark reminder that even brilliance faltered under the strain of a war turning against them. The Imperial Navy still attempted to deploy what small numbers they had in strategic hotspots across the Pacific, and for a brief moment, the new torpedoes delivered shocking results, an American destroyer vanishing in a thunderous flash of white water, a transport ship ripped apart in seconds. But these isolated victories were fleeting, because by the time more of the weapons were ready, America had already learned how to spot the faint signs of their approach, the subtle disturbance in sonar patterns, the delayed echo in the depths, and even the timing of Japanese firing sequences, all details extracted from the prototype's internal data, which the Americans had studied with relentless precision, as U.S. commanders integrated countermeasures into fleet strategies. Japan's new weapon, designed to be an unstoppable force, became increasingly ineffective, trapped in a cycle of diminishing returns and desperately shrinking resources. And in the field, Japanese submarine captains found themselves increasingly frustrated, firing beautifully engineered torpedoes that should have struck with devastating accuracy, only to watch American ships evade them with uncanny agility, as if the enemy knew exactly when the attack was coming. Suspicion grew among Japanese crews, whispers spreading that perhaps the Americans had somehow uncovered their secret, and though their officers denied it, the doubts gnawed at morale, eroding the confidence that had once fueled their silent, deadly operations. Across the Pacific, American submarines were becoming more aggressive, pushing into areas once considered too dangerous. Emboldened by their new defensive knowledge, and as their strikes increased in frequency, Japan's dwindling merchant fleet suffered heavy losses, each sunken transport choking off vital supplies of oil, steel, and food, tightening the noose around the empire's war machine. Every blow landed by American submarines now carried the hidden influence of that damaged prototype, because with each engagement the U.S. Navy grew more adept at recognizing the patterns and limitations of the once feared weapon, turning Japan's technological triumph into a fading shadow of what it could have been. On the American home front, factories roared with renewed purpose, producing improved sonar arrays, reinforced hull designs, and rapid-turn rudder systems inspired directly by reverse-engineered data, strengthening the resilience of U.S. ships to a level Japan could no longer match, and these advancements spread quickly across the Pacific Fleet, empowering captains who had once feared the deadly reach of Japanese torpedoes to maneuver with newfound confidence. The transformation was so sudden, so profound, that many American officers privately wondered how Japan had allowed such a crucial weapon to fall into enemy hands. But those questions mattered little now. What mattered was survival, dominance, and the relentless march towards securing control of the seas. Yet even as America fortified its defenses, the psychological impact on Japan began to show. No longer could their commanders rely on the invisible terror of long-range torpedo strikes to tilt the odds in their favor. No longer could they assume the enemy was blind to their approach, and as that fearsome advantage evaporated, the foundation of their naval strategy began to crack, leaving experienced captains uncertain, hesitant, and increasingly aware that the Pacific was no longer a hunting ground. It was becoming a battlefield they were slowly losing. This unraveling became most evident during a series of nighttime engagements where Japanese destroyers attempted to unleash coordinated torpedo volleys that should have inflicted catastrophic damage, only to watch in disbelief as American vessels executed precise, almost preemptive evasive maneuvers, slipping out of harm's way with frustrating ease, prompting some Japanese officers to accuse their own intelligence units of leaks, unaware that the true leak lay rotting quietly in a jungle miles away, discovered by chance, yet powerful enough to reshape the destiny of nations. And while Japan struggled to understand why their feared weapon no longer dominated the seas, America pushed forward with unrelenting momentum, fully aware that time, industry, and intelligence were now firmly on their side, and that the secret they had uncovered, this one accidental glimpse into Japan's hidden strength, had handed them a subtle but decisive edge that would ripple through every naval engagement to come, tightening the pressure on an already strained enemy, and pushing the Pacific War further toward its inevitable turning point. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. And as 1944 pressed deeper into the Pacific, the consequences of America's discovery began to ripple outward in ways Japan had never anticipated, shaping battles hundreds of miles apart, influencing decisions inside war rooms Tokyo believed were still hidden from foreign eyes. Because with every new engagement, with every Japanese torpedo that failed to strike its mark, the Americans gathered more data. Small patterns, subtle timings, sonar reflections, pressure waves, and each fragment of information layered itself atop the intelligence extracted from the recovered prototype, creating a comprehensive map of Japan's once secret weapons system, a map that allowed U.S. commanders to anticipate not only how the torpedoes behaved but how the Japanese captains who relied on them would think, maneuver, and react under pressure, and this deepening insight carved a widening gulf between the two navies. A gulf Japan could no longer bridge, no matter how bravely its sailors fought or how desperately its engineers worked to modify the design before their shrinking resources ran out. By the time American forces prepared for the Marianas Campaign, an operation Japan believed would be repelled with overwhelming torpedo strength, the reality was quietly tilting in America's favor, because the U.S. fleet now approached with layers of countermeasures hidden beneath calm waters. Revised evasion protocols drilled into every crew, destroyers equipped with upgraded sonar filters that had been fine-tuned using data from the captured weapon, and even submarine wolf packs positioned to intercept Japanese vessels before they could close into effective firing range. And when the Imperial Navy finally unleashed its long-range torpedoes during the battle, fully expecting the devastating domino effect they had once delivered, the results shocked them to their core. Instead of hearing explosions rip through American hulls, Japanese commanders watched through binoculars as U.S. ships twisted, turned, and broke formation in perfectly choreographed patterns, slipping past the deadly spreads with coordination so uncanny it looked less like reaction and more like prediction, as if the Americans could see the torpedoes before they were even fired, and panic spread across Japanese decks as the realization took hold that their secret weapon, the advantage they had counted on to crush any large-scale American assault, was no longer a secret at all. Word of the failure traveled quickly up the chain of command, reaching Tokyo with a weight that settled on the shoulders of strategists already buckling from months of bad news, and in a dimly lit conference room lit by a single overhead lamp, Admiral Toyota stared at the latest battle report and whispered a truth none of his officers wanted to hear. "They know," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "They know everything." And though attempts were made to deny, minimize, or rationalize the situation, the evidence kept stacking higher. Too many missed hits, too many perfectly executed evasions, too many American maneuvers that matched weaknesses embedded deep in the torpedo's design. As the truth hardened in their minds, Japanese engineers scrambled to create a revised model, something faster, louder, more unpredictable. But the Empire's supply chain had already fractured beyond repair. Steel was rationed, factories were bombed. Skilled laborers were dwindling, and the few promising prototypes that emerged either failed at sea trials or never made it past the blueprint stage, leaving the Imperial Navy trapped with a weapon that had become increasingly symbolic of their fading power. Brilliant in theory, devastating when unknown, but vulnerable once exposed, an echo of a fading tactical era. Meanwhile, on the American side, confidence surged through the ranks as the fleet advanced deeper into Japan's defensive perimeter, destroying convoys, dismantling supply lines, and pushing the enemy toward a war of attrition it could no longer sustain. And in submarine bases from Pearl Harbor to Fremantle, quiet pride spread among the officers who had worked tirelessly to reverse engineer the stolen prototype, because though the public would never know their names, every victory at sea bore fingerprints of their relentless determination to outthink and outmaneuver an enemy whose innovation had once seemed untouchable. The turning point became undeniable during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where Japanese commanders deployed remaining long-range torpedoes in one desperate attempt to halt the massive American landing operation. But once again the strikes that were meant to cripple the U.S. fleet instead fizzled into missed opportunities, the American ships evading with such precision that even surviving Japanese captains swore the enemy must have had spies inside their own arsenals. And though no one aboard those Japanese vessels could fathom the truth, the reality was far more devastating. The Empire had lost its edge not through betrayal, but through one overlooked, abandoned, seemingly insignificant piece of war material left rotting in a jungle clearing months earlier, a single mistake that spiraled into a strategic collapse. As the American fleet surged forward, island after island falling under their control, the myth of Japanese superiority in torpedo warfare, a myth that had terrified sailors since the early days of the war, shrank into a ghost of its former self, and by 1945, even the once legendary Japanese long-range torpedo had become little more than a footnote, overshadowed by the overwhelming industrial force and technological momentum America now wielded. Yet the story did not end on the battlefield, because after the war, when U.S. analysts compiled the full record of captured equipment, field reports, and intelligence breakthroughs, the significance of the recovered prototype became clear. It had not simply neutralized a single weapon, it had tipped the naval balance of the Pacific, allowing America to dismantle Japan's strategy piece by piece, engagement by engagement, until the once fearsome Imperial Navy could no longer fight with the ferocity that had defined its early victories. And in the years that followed, military historians often debated how different the Pacific War might have looked had Japan retrieved or destroyed the prototype before American scouts discovered it, some arguing that its long-range capabilities could have inflicted catastrophic losses on the U.S. fleet, others insisting that America's intelligence network would eventually have uncovered the secret anyway. But all agreed on one truth: Japan's greatest weapon became their greatest liability the moment it fell into American hands, and that single accident accelerated the fall of an empire. In the end, the jungle-recovered torpedo remained locked away in a sealed American vault, its corroded metal a silent reminder of how fragile the course of war can be, how entire strategies, entire empires, can shift because of one forgotten object lying in the dirt, waiting to be found. And though the Imperial Navy had once dreamed that this weapon would rewrite the future of naval warfare, they never imagined that its discovery by the enemy would instead help seal their fate, altering the Pacific forever, carving a permanent lesson into the memory of nations. That in war, secrets are as deadly as bullets, and losing one can change the world. Comment below, what part of this story hit you the most? Thank you for watching this chapter of history all the way to the end.